Assalamu alaikum everyone. This is Asma Afzal, and the topic that we're going to discuss today is confessional poetry. In this lecture, you will learn about confessional poetry, that what is confessional poetry, how it came into origin, and who were the major confessional poets, what are the key features of confessional poetry, and what is the importance of confessional poetry basically. So let us get started. We'll start with the definition of confessional poetry. If we come towards the definition of confessional poetry, we see that basically confessional poetry is such a type of poetry which deals with the personal history and experiences of the poet. It is a sort of poetry that has the main focus on the personality itself, or on the self, on the personal experiences. So the key word that we can associate with confessional poetry is personal, is self. So this is very important over here, and that is why most of the times we see that in confessional poetry there is an abundant use of first person narrator. uh, if we go into the history, we will find out that confessional poetry emerged in United States right after the World War II, in the decades following World War II, during the late 1950s and 1960s. Basically, it is thought that confessional poetry came into origin as a reaction, as a rebuttal to the depersonalized and academic poetry of the writers like T.S. Eliot and W.H. Auden, who were very well known at that particular time. They basically thought that depersonalization is very important in poetry, and the poet must not associate his own personality into poetry. And this was the time period when such sort of poetry was quite prevalent. So the confessional poets basically provided a rebuttal or a reaction to such sort of poetry. Moreover, this poetry also came into origin because at that particular time it was considered that the domestic city and the domestic life was something very ideal, and this particular notion was also being idealized in poetry. A lot of poetry was being written about idealization of domestic life and the perfection of the personal life. So these confessional poets basically opposed this notion. They did not agree with it, and they revealed the other side of the picture. They revealed the unhappy, sad and gloomy side of the domestic life and the personal life, and they presented this picture for the audience, for the readers, to know that there is nothing like an ideal domestic life, because it varies from person to person. It varies according to the circumstances. Somebody's personal life and domestic life quite be ideal, but it is not necessary for all the cases. So if somebody is not having that ideal sort of domestic life, it does not mean that he or she should not talk about it. We will see that among the major features of confessional poetry, we'll discuss that one of the key features is that it talks about those topics which were considered taboos. So this was also one of the taboos. People who were suffering from an unideal or unhappy domestic life and personal life, they were not considered to be normal. They were not encouraged to talk about it. So when you do not talk about something, of course you cannot resolve that issue. In order to resolve a problem, the first step is to understand it, to take it as a problem, to acknowledge it as a problem, to talk about it, and only then you can find out the solutions for that problem. So if you present the domestic life, the personal life, as something all ideal and all happy, and people are not allowed to talk about it as something that is not normal, or something that is not ideal, something that does not provide them the happiness or the satisfaction that is considered to be associated with it, this is not normal. So basically the confessional poets encouraged the people to talk about these issues, to take these issues as problems, to think about them as problems, because only then people would be able to find out the solutions to these problems. Uh, if we look into the history, we'll find out that Robert Lowell was the first one who basically started, or who basically started writing confessional poetry. He was a professor at Boston University, and Sexton and Plath were quite influenced by them, since Sylvia Plath is also included in your syllabus. So you must know that Sylvia Plath was quite influenced by Robert Lowell. She used to attend his lectures and his seminars, and she was quite influenced by his thoughts and his ideology. That is why we see that there is quite a big reflection of his thoughts in her poetry also. The term confessional poetry was first of all coined in 1959 by M.L. Rosenthal, who was a critic, and he was giving his review on Robert Lowell's work, Life Studies. In his review, he basically presented this word. He used this word confessional poetry for the first time. So if we even look at it, we find out that it was a review of Robert Lowell's work, for which the word confessional poetry was considered. So that is why we also call Robert Lowell as the founding father of confessional poetry. Let us move towards the major features of confessional poetry. First of all, it is postmodern in nature. If we see the modern trades, we find out that it is quite different from modern trade. Let us keep it for the later portion. There we will discuss it in detail. Let's move towards the next point. The major features of confessional poetry includes the discovery of self through poetry. As I have already told you, when you talk about things, when you talk about them openly, when you take it normal to talk about such subjects that are not considered normal otherwise, you basically try to know yourself in a better way. And in this way, you are revealing yourself. You know yourself better. And when you know yourself better, you can treat yourself better. So basically, it is cathartic. Another important feature of confessional poetry is that it deals with very intimate subject matters, such topics, such subject matters were not discussed, were not presented openly before that. It also includes personal confessions sometimes, and most of the times its focus is upon the poet's personal life. It can include their relationships, their family life, their childhood, their nostalgias, and everything that the writer basically goes through. It also deals with their personal issues, their conflicts, their resentments, loneliness, fears. These are very important in confessional poetry. Loneliness is one of the what you can say most important features of confessional poetry that is discussed in confessional poetry. Another important feature of confessional poetry is breaking of taboos. As I have already told you, that in confessional poetry such topics were discussed which were considered taboos otherwise, which were not discussed openly, which were not considered normal to discuss. For example, about mental illnesses, they were not considered something to talk about, something to tell people about. And as I've already told you, if you will not tell others about it, if you will not talk about it, if you will not understand it as something problematic, you will never find a solution for it. And the other taboos that they broke through confessional poetry was talking about sexuality, about suicide, drug addiction, depression, miscarriages. As you can see in Sylvia Plath, I'm giving you references from Sylvia Plath, and I will also organize a separate lecture for that, because you've read Sylvia Plath in your syllabus. Then another important feature of confessional poetry is that we find out that there is a complete openness between the poet and the reader. The poet and the reader are considered to be one and the same. They are interchangeable. They are not separate. They are not isolated from each other. the reader, while reading the writing of that particular poet, he feels as if he is in the shoes of that poet, and he can feel what he actually feels. This is the intensity, this is the strength of confessional poetry, that the reader can feel it in such a depth. So and when we say that there is a complete openness between the poet and reader, it means that the poet even is very honest and very sincere while writing these sort of poetry. He does not try to hide anything from the reader. He is basically revealing everything. And then use of first person narrator, I have already told you, since it is very personal in nature, so of course it uses first person narrator. Okay, now we move towards the topic that we skipped previously, that is how confessional poetry basically varies from the modern poetry. Basically, if we look into modern poetry, the poetry, the art was considered to be something different, apart, isolated from the creator, from the poet, from the artist, in modernism, in modern ideology. It was considered, according to the modern poets, that there is no room for self, for personal experiences, for the personal issues of the poet in poetry. The poetry must deal with grander issues, with topics which are general, which are not personal, which are quite what you can say depersonalized sort of topics. So basically it has got nothing to do with subjective sort of poetry. The main topics, the main concern of the modern poetry was with the objectivity, the concern was with the objective nature of topics. However, for confessional poets, it was not the case. They did not adhere to this ideology. They thought and they considered that poetry and poet are one and the same. The art and artist are one and the same. We cannot separate them. If an artist is creating an art that he himself does not understand, how can he justify that sort of art? This is the thought of confessional poets. They thought that if the poet has not experienced something himself, how can he justify it in his writings? How can he convey it wholly and solely to his readers? How can he justify it? So basically, in order to justify the topic, in order to justify whatever the poet is writing about, he must have a personal experience, a personal knowledge, a first-hand experience of that topic. That is very important. So that is why there was quite a variation between the confessional poets and the modern poets, because the confessional poets thought that it is very important to portray the personal perspective of the poet in the poetry. The major names among the confessional poets, the most important names among the confessional poets are Sylvia Plath, Robert Lowell, John Berryman, Anne Sexton, Allen Ginsberg, and W.G. Snodgrass. You are familiar with Sylvia Plath only because she is included in your syllabus, but you can find references to others also very easily. Okay, so until now we have discussed that what is confessional poetry. Now we will briefly go through the importance of confessional poetry, although we have discussed it a little. Since we are saying that confessional poetry is revealing, it is a journey towards the self, so basically it helps the writer and the reader both to understand themselves, to understand their emotions and feelings. Because if they will not talk about them openly, they will not think about it openly. Sometimes you feel there are certain things that are going on in our mind, and they do not appear to be very clear, and we are not sure about it. And when we discuss those things with others, when we write down those things, we find a different perspective to them. We understand those very things very clearly. So this is the basic thing that is going on over here. So basically, confessional poetry provides a therapy. It provides a source of catharsis for the writer and the reader both, because both are one and the same. they are interconnected. That was all about confessional poetry, introduction of confessional poetry. I hope you understand it. If you have any kind of questions, if you have any confusions, any ambiguities, you are free to ask me anytime. You can comment in the comment box, or you can contact me directly. I will be there for you. uh, Take care, stay safe. Thank you so much. We'll meet in the next lecture. Allah Hafiz.